The end of World War II in Europe marked not just the cessation of active combat, but the beginning of a vast and often uncomfortable reckoning with the remnants of war. Among the most striking symbols of German military power during the conflict were the massive rail guns, colossal weapons capable of unleashing unimaginable destruction from fixed positions on the ground. These guns, a symbol of engineering prowess and military ambition, now found themselves caught in the same wave of obsolescence and abandonment that swept through much of the war's remaining material. The fate of these monstrous weapons, which had once commanded awe and fear, was determined by a complex mixture of logistical strain, economic pressure, and shifting priorities that characterized the post-war landscape. As Germany's surrender in May 1945 brought the war to an end, the Allied forces were faced with the daunting task of dealing with the war's legacy. Thousands of guns, tanks, aircraft, and other military technologies required a resolution either through disposal, repurposing, or, in some cases, complete scrapping. The railguns, of which Germany had produced only a handful, were particularly troublesome in this regard. Their enormous size, limited tactical utility, and specialized nature made them impractical for continued military use in the post-war period. With the war's end, the already strained German military infrastructure was in ruins, and there was no place for such unwieldy weapons. The two largest of these guns, the Schwere Gustav and the Dora, were the most famous, having been used to bombard Soviet positions during the siege of Sevastopol in 1942. Both of these weapons were built to fire massive shells that weighed up to 7,100 kilograms and could reach targets as far as 37 kilometers away. Their size and complexity made them logistical nightmares, requiring massive amounts of railroad track, a dedicated crew, and substantial resources just to keep them operational. The sheer cost of operating these weapons was enormous. To transport them required specialized rail cars and tracks, with the Schwere Gustav needing over 500 railway cars to move its various components. Once in position, the guns consumed vast amounts of ammunition and required lengthy periods of time to reassemble and prepare for firing. After the war, however, the military usefulness of these guns became irrelevant. The advancing technological landscape rendered them outdated. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft had become far more mobile and capable, and the railguns' cumbersome nature made them anachronisms in the modern world. The Schwere Gustav and Dora were already obsolete when they were first used in combat, and by the time of the war's end, they were no longer able to perform any meaningful military function. The immediate fate of the two heavy guns began to unfold in the wake of the German surrender. The guns were located in different parts of the country, with the Schwere Gustav having been stationed in the Crimea and the Dora at the Kummersdorf Army Research Facility in Brandenburg. Their massive size and the complexity involved in dismantling them presented a considerable challenge for the Allies. The Schwere Gustav, which had been abandoned near Sevastopol when the German army retreated, was eventually captured by the Soviets, who decided to dismantle it in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of any remaining German forces or the Allies. The Dora, on the other hand, was captured by the Red Army in May 1945, but it was in no condition for immediate use. Its components were strewn across the countryside as the Germans had abandoned the gun during their retreat, and much of it was rendered unusable due to lack of proper maintenance. The Soviet Union, in particular, faced immense pressure to quickly deal with the guns. The immediate post-war period in the USSR was one of enormous economic strain and logistical chaos. The war had taken a catastrophic toll on Soviet infrastructure, and the nation's factories, railroads, and industrial capacity were in disarray. The priorities of the Soviet leadership were to rebuild the economy, modernize the military, and restore order to a war-ravaged country. The weight of maintaining the massive railguns was not only financially impractical but also symbolically unnecessary. In 1946, the Soviet government made the decision to dismantle the Schwere Gustav and Dora. The guns were stripped of their useful parts, including their heavy artillery components and ammunition systems, and the remaining metal was sent to scrap yards. Despite this, the story of these weapons did not end simply in the scrap heap. The fate of the parts of the Schwere Gustav and Dora, as well as other large weapons systems, became emblematic of the larger post-war effort to rid Europe of the remnants of the war. For the Soviets, This was not merely a matter of military efficiency, it was also about erasing the legacy of Nazi Germany's war machine. The public spectacle of dismantling the guns was both a practical matter and a symbolic act, as the remnants of Hitler's war effort were reduced to scrap in a quiet, methodical fashion that matched the general disillusionment with the war. Meanwhile, in the western zones of occupation, the Allies faced their own challenges in dealing with the surplus of German weapons. The Americans, British, and French, while less focused on the destruction of such symbols, still had to deal with the practical aspects of military equipment disposal. For the Western Allies, the focus was on securing technological advances, such as German rockets and jet technology, while the rest of the military equipment, particularly the massive, outdated artillery pieces, was considered expendable. There were occasional attempts to use the large railguns for ceremonial purposes or even as tools for defense in the early years of the Cold War, but these were quickly abandoned as impractical. The Allies also prioritized economic recovery and stability, and there was little interest in preserving such large, cumbersome weapons when there were more immediate needs for resources, rebuilding, and modernizing the economy. The fate of the German railguns serves as a striking example of how military technologies, no matter how advanced or destructive, can quickly lose their relevance once the conditions that gave rise to them are gone. The massive guns, which had been symbols of the industrial might of Nazi Germany, were dismantled and forgotten, their parts scattered or melted down in the aftermath of war. Even though these weapons were once considered cutting-edge, they became nothing more than a drain on resources, and their scale, once awe-inspiring, quickly became a burden that no one wanted to bear. What followed was a quiet, bureaucratic process of destruction and disposal, an inevitable end to the weapons that had once dominated the battlefield. But not all railguns met such an abrupt end. As the Allies and Soviets focused on rebuilding their own war machines, some larger-scale artillery pieces found their way into new roles, particularly in the nascent Cold War. However, this process was slow, and the guns that had once dominated Europe's front lines were now relegated to history's fringes. As 1946 progressed, the decision-making process surrounding these weapons became more settled. It was not only the immensity of the railguns that led to their obsolescence but the ever-encroaching costs of maintaining such vast systems. And with that, the story of Germany's most infamous war machines slowly faded into the machinery of post-war recovery. By the late 1940s, the fate of the German railguns, those titanic relics of Nazi ambition, was sealed, but the remnants of their existence would continue to echo in the industrial landscapes of post-war Europe. While the Schwer Gustav and Dora had been dismantled and largely forgotten, their components, steel, iron, and ammunition, found new lives in the efforts to rebuild war-torn economies. As the Soviet Union and the Western Allies turned their attention to rebuilding and rearming for the emerging Cold War, the monumental guns were consigned to history, a symbol of how advanced technology could quickly be swept aside by the brutal realities of both war and peace. The decision to scrap the railguns was, in essence, a financial one. The industrial and logistical costs associated with maintaining, transporting, and firing such massive artillery pieces were prohibitive, particularly in an era where efficiency and mobility were paramount. To operate a railgun required not just a dedicated crew, but an extensive infrastructure of railways, tracks, and machinery. The transportation alone was a logistical nightmare. The Schwer Gustav, for example, required over 500 railway cars to move its components across the continent. In a Europe now struggling to rebuild its shattered infrastructure, such extravagance was untenable. For the Soviets, the decision was perhaps even more pronounced. After the war, the Soviet Union faced not only the colossal task of reconstruction but also the challenge of consolidating its position in Europe. The vastness of the USSR, with its immense distances and sparse infrastructure, made the heavy, cumbersome railguns even less practical. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin, had little patience for military technology that did not align with the realities of the Soviet state. The emphasis shifted toward mobility, mechanization, and the development of nuclear weapons, technologies that promised to shape the future of warfare far more effectively than the enormous steel giants that had once roared across the front lines of the Eastern Front. As a result, the railguns were reduced to nothing more than a historical curiosity, their potential and destruction consigned to the archives. The mass disposal of these weapons was a deeply symbolic act. In the aftermath of World War II, both the Soviet Union and the Western powers were keen to erase the symbols of Nazi militarism. The massive artillery pieces, which had once been touted as masterpieces of German engineering, were dismantled and stripped of all utility. In some cases, the guns were melted down for scrap metal, while in others, their parts were sent to industrial complexes for recycling. The steel that had once been forged into weapons of mass destruction was now repurposed for civilian industries, helping to rebuild the shattered economies of Europe. The symbolic act of destroying the guns was also a psychological one, an attempt to rid the continent of the remnants of Nazi Germany and its technological legacy. In the years following the war, the disposal of large-scale German artillery was not limited to just the Schwere Gustav and Dora. Across Europe, other colossal weapons, from battleships to tanks, were similarly scrapped or repurposed. The sheer scale of these weapons was a reminder of the industrial might that had powered Nazi Germany's war effort, but it also illustrated the disconnect between wartime innovation and post-war necessity. For many of the surviving nations, these weapons were not just impractical but also a burden, a reminder of the past that needed to be erased. Yet, in the midst of the systematic dismantling of the German railguns, there were occasional attempts to salvage or preserve certain aspects of Nazi military technology. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were eager to gain any advantage they could from the remnants of the German war machine. As the two superpowers began to jockey for influence, they engaged in a scientific and technological race that would define much of the next several decades. German innovations in rocketry, jet propulsion, and electronics were seen as valuable, and many German scientists and engineers were absorbed into the respective programs of the Allies and the Soviets. But these attempts to harness the knowledge behind German technology did not extend to the railguns. Despite their advanced engineering, the guns were simply too impractical for any serious post-war military application. The colossal size, the need for specialized infrastructure, and the extraordinary cost of operating these guns outweighed any potential military benefit. Even though they had once been revered as some of the most advanced artillery in the world, they were now irrelevant in a world where speed, mobility, and precision had become the hallmarks of military technology. The railguns that had been the pride of Nazi engineering were no longer seen as viable instruments of war. The abandonment of such weapons, along with the massive scale of their destruction, underscored a deeper theme in post-war Europe, the end of the era of industrial-scale warfare. The railguns had been designed for an age where battles were fought with sheer mass and brute force, but in the aftermath of the war, the new age of warfare was rapidly taking shape. Tanks, aircraft, and, eventually, nuclear weapons promised to reshape the nature of military conflict. As the world's superpowers turned their attention to nuclear deterrence and the development of precision-guided munitions, the lumbering giants of World War II were relegated to the scrap heap. Yet, even in their destruction, the railguns left an indelible mark on history. Their very existence had served as a testament to the extreme lengths to which the Nazi regime had gone to create the most powerful weapons of war. The Schwere Gustav and the Dora were not mere instruments of destruction, they were symbols of the hubris that had fueled the German war effort. Their abandonment, dismantling, and ultimate obscurity served as a quiet reminder of how quickly such symbols of power could fall into irrelevance. As the Cold War deepened in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the legacy of the railguns became a subject of historical curiosity rather than military concern. In the Soviet Union, the guns were remembered as part of the larger narrative of Nazi Germany's failed ambitions, while in the West, they faded from collective memory as new technologies took center stage. Few people in the 1950s or 1960s would have even remembered the names Schwere Gustav or Dora. The massive guns had ceased to be relevant, not just in terms of military strategy but also in terms of technological development. They had become historical curiosities, reminders of a bygone age of warfare. In the years that followed, the world moved on. New weapons were developed, and new technologies emerged that shaped the military and geopolitical landscape of the post-war era. The railguns, colossal though they were, had no place in this new world. They had been victims of their own technological excess. The forces that had created them, the drive for domination, the belief in technological superiority, the industrial might of the Nazi regime, had all collapsed with the fall of the Third Reich. In the end, the railguns were reduced to nothing more than scrap metal, their steel and iron refashioned into the tools of a peacetime economy. What had once been a symbol of military might was now an industrial afterthought. Their legacy, though, is one of both the destructive power of war and the fleeting nature of technological innovation. The guns, for all their imposing size and firepower, had proven themselves to be nothing more than a burden in the face of an uncertain post-war world. By the 1950s, the railguns had become little more than forgotten monoliths of a bygone era. The technological dream of Nazi Germany, symbolized by these massive weapons, had been buried in the rubble of war, and with it, the railguns were lost to history.